Let's start the meeting. I'm Carol Reinking, co-president of the League of Women Voters, and I'm really pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Emily Calderon. Emily was scheduled with us 2 years ago, and then COVID interfered. So we're glad to have her back. And Emily is the city planner. And I got this off the internet, Emily, so correct me if this is not the most recent information, that the city planning and zoning is responsible for developing and managing and maintaining the city's comprehensive plan, the zoning ordinance, and the land development code. And you coordinate the proceedings of the Zoning Board of Appeals, the Plan Commission, and the Land Committee. Is that fairly
That's
accurate?
all correct. That's it. That's it and then some.
Okay, good. All right. Well, I'm glad to welcome you, and I will turn the meeting over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight and talk with you all a little bit about planning and zoning and what's going on in my little corner of the city. So I made a PowerPoint presentation. It's just got some notes on it and some general headings as we talk through things. So I'm going to share that. In 1 second. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about tonight, and Carol gave me some bullet points for a frame of reference here. So we're going to talk a little bit about zoning generally, including special use permits and variances and some of those things that happen within zoning. We're going to talk about design guidelines, our I-55 development plan, and the housing study, which just kicked off last night. So moving right along, I want to talk first just a little bit about what zoning is. So in terms of zoning, I have a little zoning map here on the right side of the screen, and this is just a snapshot of the city's official zoning map for part of the city. And you'll see, I guess down here, this would be like the new BJC Center, this would be Kohl's, and then you have some of the fast food restaurants up this way. So the area here in orange, the darker orange color is B2, that's our commercial business district. The darker yellow color is our multifamily residential district, and the lighter yellow color is our single family residential district. So our whole city is broken up into various zones, and within each zone, the city regulates both the uses, so whether the property can be used for a bank or a restaurant or a manufacturing facility. And it also regulates bulk standards. And bulk standards are, for example, setbacks or building height or lot coverage of the building on the lot. So those are called our bulk standards. And then within each zoning district, we have a list of permitted uses and special uses. So the permitted uses are those uses that are permitted by right. So in our B2 district, we permit restaurants by right. As long as you meet your setback requirements, you can purchase a lot and get a building permit and build your building. Special use permits, however, are required for some other uses in the B2 district. So if you would like to have a restaurant with a drive-through, you're required to get a special use permit. And the special use permit is a special application that you make to our Zoning Board of Appeals. And it just allows the city to give a little bit more consideration to the request. We have the opportunity to look at, traffic patterns, for example, make sure you have enough stacking spaces, that there's not going to be any concern on that parcel, and there's not any parcels nearby that require special protection. So in order to get a special use permit, one would apply, they would file their application with the city. It would go to our Zoning Board of Appeals, which is an advisory board, and then on to our city council for final approval. So the idea is that special uses should be allowed unless there is something going on with the property or around the property that would require some special protection or special attention. Variances, on the other hand, are a little bit different. I'll move on. This is actually some language from our zoning code. So you can see here that special use permits are, like I said, granted by the board. And the zoning board has certain standards they have to apply when making their decision. So they're not allowed to hear a case and vote on it just based on how they feel. If they think there might be too much traffic or they feel some certain way or another, they actually have to follow these 5 standards. So they have to consider these 5 things and nothing else. So they have to consider, nearby uses of property. They have to consider the effect that the proposed use would have on adjacent properties. They have to consider whether or not the proposed use would alter the public health, safety, and welfare of the community. They have to consider whether the relative gain compared to the hardship and whether that's necessary. And they also have to consider the suitability of the project for other purposes allowed in the zoning ordinance. So, it's a very strict kind of set of guidelines that they have to follow. A variance, on the other hand, is, for example, a variance would be that you buy a piece of property and you'd like to build a building closer to the front property line than what is normally allowed. So a variance is just like what it sounds. It's a variation in the city's rules and the city's codes of ordinances. So standards for considering a variance are different than those for a special use permit. And the issue with variances is that the city should not be granting them if there is a self-imposed hardship. So for example, if I own my home and it meets the current setbacks and it meets all of the regulations, and I decide one day that I'd like to build an addition onto my home, and the addition that I'd like to build is going to be too close to the side property line. So I petition the Zoning Board of Appeals and apply for a variance to build closer to the side property line than what's normally allowed. That would actually be considered a self-imposed hardship. So in theory, the board should be voting to deny that request. It's considered self-imposed because that property owner was fully aware of the rules and regulations. They don't have to build their addition that big. They're not required to do so. It's nothing that is being imposed on that property owner. Rather, they're doing it to themselves. So it's a self-imposed hardship. So the city actually grants very few variances because it's very hard to beat the self-imposed hardship qualification. So as we review these, and just like special uses, we have these 7 factors here that the board is required to consider, and they consider these 7 factors and nothing more, nothing less. They're kind of like a quasi-judicial body, so they're similar to, a judge or a jury in their role in this. So it's very hard to get a variance approved. And feel free, I don't think there's too many people on here, to ask questions if you have them as we go. I want to make sure it's clear for everyone. So otherwise, I'll just keep moving along.
Okay.
Emily, I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
If I have a piece of property, I bought, let's say a lot, and what I propose to build on the lot meets all all zoning requirements. And what you call was it the bulk? The bulk.
The setback and the height.
It meets all that. Can people appeal that? People like around me appeal it if they didn't want a house there? Or if I'm within the zoning law, am I covered?
Yeah.
Yeah,
you are.
Okay.
We do get that question a lot. Some people call and say, "Oh, I saw this going on here and I don't like it." But if it meets every regulation we have no ability to deny a permit.
Gotcha.
If the city did deny a permit, the person who applied for it could take the city to court, and we would definitely lose,
Okay.
for
That's
withholding
good
a
to know.
permit from someone.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
when
you.
they meet all of our regulations. Yep, of course. So we've been making a lot of changes to our ordinances over the last several years. And one of the changes we've made recently is regarding design guidelines. So there have been lots of discussions that have happened in recent years about how buildings look and the standard of development within the city, especially in commercial areas. So the city hired Tesco Associates, they're a firm out of the Chicago area, to help us with several zoning code updates. And we just did this because, there's only so much of our time to go around as city staff. We don't have a lot of time to come up with, these kinds of guidelines. So our design guidelines apply to every zoning district in the city. And we have different guidelines for the manufacturing district and the commercial district and the downtown area. And I just took some examples here. In every zoning district, our guidelines will apply to the site. So the building on the site and how it's situated. So an example of that would be in our commercial district, our guideline is to minimize visibility of loading docks and storage areas by locating them away from the primary building access. So we want them out of view and kind of tucked away so they're not the main focal point. We also touch on landscaping and building design in every one of our zoning districts. So landscaping guideline, for example, would be to install foundation landscaping. So landscaping right around the foundation of the building to keep commercial properties looking nice. And in terms of building design, we might require that masonry buildings be designed with brick size in mind. So in the downtown area, for example, in historic buildings, we have small, oftentimes it's soft brick, but very small scale bricks on buildings. If you go to the commercial district, the AT&T store in Edwardsville, right next to QT or across the street from QT is a really good example. If you notice the bricks on that building, they're much larger. They're utility size bricks. And although they look rectangle and similar to what you would see in a building downtown, their size is very different. And if you built a building with utility bricks in a downtown historic area, it would look very much out of place. So these guidelines are part of our zoning code, and every zoning district has, 10 to 15 guidelines for each one of these 3 items. And, it's not the law. You don't have to check the box for every single guideline, but we use these as a tool to make sure that the character and the quality of development that comes to Edwardsville is meeting that certain standard. So like we would hand these to a developer when they come in and say, I'd like to build a building here. We would say, great, when you design it, take a look at our design guidelines and make sure you're in line with, most of what we have listed here. So they've been, we've had to use them, or we've been able to use them a handful of times. They're relatively new. They were approved in 2021. So a lot of the buildings that are coming out of the ground right now were actually issued building permits before these were approved. But, we're happy that we've adopted these and we have this on the books moving forward.
I have a question about that.
Yeah, yeah.
Are there any environmental aspects to the design? I mean, not just, you're talking about the exterior design, but what about environmental things there, like native plants or plants that withstand heat and don't have to be watered, or buildings? I see so many buildings going up, dark brick, dark roofs, which just absorb the heat in the summertime and just radiate heat all around them.
Yeah, we do have native landscaping guidelines, so that's definitely part of it. In terms of like site design and landscaping, I think in some areas in our commercial areas, we suggest using like bioswales and things like that with native plants. There is no guideline, from what I recall, about roof color, but that's a very good point and one we could look at in the future.
Well, I know there's the new buildings there on Goshen Road for the hospital buildings. Some of those are, dark red brick and orange brick and everything. They look like about It looked like they're over 100 degrees just looking at them. I just wondered, if there's any guidelines for things like that.
Yeah.
Whereas the Y and the other places around the school and everything are a lighter color. And
Yeah, that's a good point. We don't regulate brick color. So, so it's really up to the developer, I guess, what they choose to, or the building owner, what they choose to go with on that front.
And Emily, I also had a question about the apartment building that was built on South Kansas. It looks very industrial, and it doesn't
Yeah.
fit in with, I guess I would call those bungalows.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it looked like there was no effort to make it kind of blend in with those houses that have already been there for years.
Yeah, so with these design guidelines, I think that building would require, or they'd be required to have different finishes that would blend in a little bit more. I can't recall the zoning district it's in, but I know that in some of our downtown area zoning districts, we do require roof lines to be similar to roof lines surrounding it. So like in our B1C district, for example, which is our downtown transition zone, if someone chooses to build a 3-story building in the middle of a block or on a corner, anywhere in the district, if the building surrounding it has pitched roofs, the building being built will be required to have a pitched roof as well. And that was something that came out of discussions about buildings like the one you just mentioned, but those seem to really stick out in more of our traditional neighborhoods. And so that was something we added to the code to, in an effort to make buildings blend in a little bit better. Good question about that. So moving right along to our I-55 development code. This is a document that is meant to regulate development within the I-55 corridor. So this is a map out of our 2016 code, and the 2016 development code was the result of a years-long planning process. It was a coordinated effort between the Village of Glen Carbon, Madison County, and the City of Edwardsville. And you can see some lines on this map. Well, we have, first of all, it's thousands of acres here that we're attempting to regulate with this code. 4,843 acres between property that's in the city, in the county, and the village. And the blue line here is the boundary agreement line between the City of Edwardsville and the Village of Glen Carbon. So the City of Edwardsville really will not have regulation over anything south of this line. It's West Mick Road here. Anything below that, the Village of Glen Carbon could annex if they choose to. Anything above that, the City of Edwardsville could annex. The orange line is the school district boundary. So Goshen, anything north of Goshen Road is in District 7. Anything south of Goshen Road is in the Triad School District. So those things are important, especially with regard to residential developments. People care about school districts, and they may not want to take their kid out of one school district and move into another. So it's just important to know about those things as we're planning for land use. So we had some development interest in this area, and in answering some questions from developers, we realized that this code, as it existed in 2016, as it was written, was going to be very difficult to use and basically impossible to implement between the land use regulations and subdivision regulations and lot size requirements. So without getting too much in the weeds, it wasn't going to be too usable of a code to really achieve the vision that it was supposed to achieve. So in 2020, we began revisions, and of course, as you can imagine, those stalled out for a little bit during COVID, and we finally picked all that back up. And we have been discussing a draft code at our ordinance committee. So we have a subcommittee of our plan commission, it's called the ordinance committee, and they deal with all the text changes that happen to our land development code and our zoning code. So they're working through some of the text and some of the policies and regulations in this development plan. Once they work through all those details, they'll send it to the full plan commission and then on to the city council for adoption. A few things that I'll mention, and I probably should have included this map, but one thing we're doing is we're reducing the size of these districts. So you'll notice here that, like, this red area, for example, I mean, this is a huge area, 742 acres. And one exercise we did as we were going through this code update is we took an aerial image of Edwardsville Crossing. So that's where Deerbergs is, that whole shopping center development. And we clipped that and we put it out here and overlaid it on this I-55 area. And it fits roughly into this little quadrant. So, you know, we're looking at maybe 6 Edwardsville crossings that could fit into this red area here. So that scale of development is something that's not, you know, not attainable at any point in the near future, and it's probably not desirable for most of our community either. So similarly, this blue area is supposed to be the town center, and we're changing that name too, because we don't want to take away from downtown. This is not meant to be a new downtown at all. So we're changing that. But you could fit 2 to 3 downtown Edwardsvilles, you know, in this area. So we have scaled back significantly, and we've changed the town center area to something that's more the size of Trace on the Parkway. So you could have maybe 1 of those in that area. So we've really scaled back the development plans, knowing that you know, the scale of this is just so huge that you know, we're just not going to experience that amount of population growth and that amount of development in the near future. So, so this is an ongoing process, and like I said, it's at our ordinance committee, and we're working through a lot of the changes and a lot of the proposed text. So you can keep an eye out for this moving forward to Plan Commission and to City Council. So hopefully by late summer, you'll see an article in the paper about this code being approved.
Emily, I've got a
Lastly,
question. I've got a question about basically how decisions are made when new things are being re-envisioned like this or modified. I know we have people doing it who are kind of trained and have experience and all that, but at what point in this process or any of these processes, even, you know, my neighbor's got a variance and they're going to build a thing in their backyard, in any of these things, what are the points where citizen involvement could happen and is best placed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So with this particular project, there were years of public engagement that went into it, not only with the city as a whole. I mean, the city was, I think they had citywide open houses, but they spent a lot of time talking to homeowners that lived in like on Long Branch and Prairie, I think it's Prairie View back here, Prairie Manor, Arbor Lake, homeowners that live kind of out in this eastern part of the city. So they met with those individuals, they met with HOA presidents, they met with property owners out there, and they came up with the vision. And with this amendment to the development code, we are not changing that vision. We are going to implement it using different tools. So we really didn't do a full public engagement effort with this because that was done a few years ago and we didn't feel the need to redo it. We're just changing like the technical ways of how we achieve it. So we have met with HOA presidents from the area, with several residents. We've met with property owners, and of course the aldermen for this area. So we are doing our best to keep people in the loop, certainly. And, you know, a lot of it, because this is so technical, you know, it's a little bit more difficult to understand. It's not just a, you know, we're not talking about a vision. We're talking about things like the process of subdividing land and how that occurs to get to this vision of what we want. So it's really the technical aspect of it rather than a plan for the area.
And to tell on this map, what area is under the control of the county board? Or is this all Edwardsville and Glen Carbon?
Yeah, so on this map, so this green boundary is just, it's a pretty accurate boundary of where the city is right now. So like the YMCA is in the city, all of this land above, this is Governor's Parkway here is in the city.
Okay.
We have Arbor Lake, Prairie Manor, and over to this area. So the north part of the intersection of I-55 and 143 is in the county. Land that is, gosh, north and south of Goshen Road. Well, this is a little bit dated too, because this was a map from 2016, but Plummer Family Park is in the city now. But the rest of this is in the county. Glen Carbon, I think, goes, down this way, but a lot of this is unincorporated in Madison County right now. Most of it, I would say. And when this land develops, whether it's a residential property or a commercial property, most likely developers will annex their property into the city of Edwardsville, or the village of Glen Carbon. So they would need water service and sanitary sewer service. And the city and the village have policies that if you're connecting to those services, you need to be in the city. So mostly development will occur, kind of in the line where those services can be provided easily, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
The last topic I wanted to touch on tonight is our housing study. So this is a topic that it's something that began basically in March of 2021. So Mayor Patton, when he was mayor, had a committee on race relations and equality in the city of Edwardsville. And one of the outcomes of that was to study housing. And so in March of 2021, I did a report on housing in the city, and I used census data to look at housing characteristics and income characteristics, and to evaluate each of those things broken out by race and ethnicity. And really the outcome of that was that we needed to hire a professional firm to come in and do a full assessment for the city using more data and better data that was available than what was available to me at the time. So over the course of last summer and last fall, we developed a request for qualifications. We put that out last fall, last December. We did interviews from various firms, and we ended up hiring the I-5 group. So they are a planning community development firm based in St. Louis. They have partnered with Community and Economic Development Solutions, as well as the SLU Urban Planning Lab led by Bob Lewis. Bob has over 40 years of experience in economic development and planning, and he has done housing studies in, I think, every state in the US. So he's very qualified, and we were excited to have him be a part of this team. But this group is going to be taking a look at both qualitative and quantitative data for housing in the city. So not only are they going to be using detailed demographic data, they're using the city's building permit data going back 20 years. They're using Madison County EA user access values to look at home values. They're looking at work patterns, commuting patterns throughout the county. But there's also going to be a qualitative side to this too. They're going to be doing small group listening sessions and interviewing focus groups throughout this process. And by October, we're going to have a needs assessment. So basically, they're going to be able to tell us what the needs are for housing in our community, so that way we can figure out what policies we need to put in place, maybe what changes we need to make to our code to make sure that we're meeting the housing needs for the city of Edwardsville. So we just had our advisory committee meeting last night, and they presented just kind of a snapshot of demographics in the city and asked the advisory committee what they believe some of the challenges are. So we're going to meet next with that advisory group at the end of July. And at that time, we'll have some data from the small group listening sessions. We'll have some more detailed data related to house building permits in the city and EAVs within the city and the county. So this is an exciting project and one that I think will be incredibly useful for the city as we, work to change policy and plan for the next decade at least. So that's all I have for tonight. I'm happy to answer questions or.
Well, I have some questions about what you were just discussing.
Sure.
And according to what Becky said too, at what point do any citizens have an opportunity to have input into this? For instance, we hear the builders saying that, oh, everybody wants these luxury apartment buildings, these 3- and 4-story luxury apartment buildings. That's what's in demand. People don't want to have to have a yard or any maintenance or things like that. Okay, where do they get this information? Are they getting it out of some of their trade magazines, or is there any data saying that?
Yeah,
I'm
I
afraid.
think they're. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
We don't want to end up with a bunch of buildings that are empty. That's not good for the city. And I was just talking to a young professional woman the other day. A young, successful professional woman who grew up in Edwardsville, and she would like to live here, but she's not in one of the high income professions. And so there's no way she could afford some of these luxury apartment buildings that are going up. She grew up in Edwardsville. She'd like to live here, but she's questioning whether, so I'm just wondering where these developers get this idea that that's what people want. That's what the city needs. I know it's less expensive. They make more money on that sort of thing, but, and they have a right to make money and to make a profit, but not necessarily to make a killing on it either. So.
Yeah, so from what I hear, those types of apartments in Edwardsville are, they're going so fast. And I think that's where they're getting this idea that there's a demand, because as soon as the units are available, they're rented like that. And, clearly there's some kind of a demand for them. But, I think this housing study is going to give us a much better picture of, the folks who live in Edwardsville, the folks who work in Edwardsville, and what our true housing needs are looking ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, do we have any, what kind of city do we want to live in? Do we have any input into that? A lot of people settled here or lived here all their lives, or they've settled here because it isn't the big city. We don't want to live in a city with lots of all the big box stores and tall apartment buildings, maybe. Do we have any input in that?
Yeah, so the city actually has a comprehensive plan, and in the comprehensive plan, it's a document that's done every 10 to 20 years. And that's the document that really sets the vision for the city. And so our last comprehensive plan was done in, I want to say 2010 or 2011. So, in the next few years, we'll start the new process of a new comprehensive plan. But that's really a document that sets the vision, and there's a broad public engagement that goes into making a comprehensive plan. There'll be several open houses, several opportunities to participate online, and all of those things.
Okay, let me intervene just a minute. I just got a phone call from the Code Red people. I wonder if anybody else did, because I know some of you have this Code Red. I have it on my phone. And they said there was a tornado warning, but it doesn't seem like the weather's threatening. Did anybody else who has Code Red get a notification?
No, we did not, and we would definitely get it here.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have the?
I had one earlier, but
on the
I had one.
percentage of unoccupied homes and businesses?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I had a hard time hearing.
Do you have the data available on unoccupied businesses and unoccupied homes? I mean, is the empty rate low or high or what?
I do not have that data. If I had to guess, I would say it's fairly low, but I don't have that right now. No.
The other question I have, which goes back to the original ones of the variances and stuff, if the homes were built, say 50, 60 years ago, obviously the setbacks were different. Those cannot be changed. Is that grandfathered in? Is that what is called?
Yeah, so we actually call those non-conforming uses. If your home is built to a standard that would no longer be permitted today, it's considered a non-conforming use, and it's legal, it's allowed to continue. You just can't expand upon it. Also, for our older areas of town, for lots platted prior to a certain year, if it's between like 50 and 75 feet wide, then we have different setback regulations, because we know that a lot of those lots that were platted in the 60s, 70s, and 80s are maybe only 60 feet wide. You're dealing with smaller lots, and so you have reduced setbacks. So we do have provisions in our code for some of the older neighborhoods in the city.
I've got a hypothetical that's along those lines. It's actually for a different community, and I'm just curious how you as a planner would see this. So I'm going to co-opt you a little bit,
Okay.
but
Sure.
it kind of relates to that. It's an instance where an area that had been developed in the 30s, 40s, and had a certain lot size, and then in this particular case, a home got burned down, and the landowner wanted to rebuild a house on the lot, and he was told by this particular city that he had the lot is like 20 feet wide by 100, and it's a very long, deep lot. But he was told that no, to build a new house, it would have to be 30. The lot had to be 30 feet wide, and he couldn't build a house on a lot that was the width of the lot. And when I took planning classes, it's a residential neighborhood. You can't put a business there. And that has, seems to me that that's potentially a taking. And I recall when we had the planning commission, the head of the planning commission for the city, he talked about that you had to do, I think, an overlay zone on your older neighborhoods because they realized the 7,000 square foot minimum lot size that you have for all the new homes didn't fit. But would you say, in your case, you recognize that if a house burns down on one of these older lots, they can never build a house on it to meet this. But a community that, in my mind, they either want to buy out I don't know if they want to buy out all the landowners and sell it to a developer, but would you, from a planning perspective, would you view the inability to build a house in a residential area as a potential takings issue?
Gosh,
Theoretically.
Yeah, I would have a hard
Emily,
time
if I can interrupt a minute,
yeah.
before you answer that, if you could stop screen sharing, I'll remove your spotlight and we can go into grid view and you can actually
sure.
see who's talking
Yeah.
to you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay.
I was the one doing talking.
Yeah, so
Okay.
yeah, I would have a hard time saying if that's a taking or not without knowing
Okay.
more about their zoning code. I would want to read their non-conforming section. Every zoning code should have a chapter on non-conformities and how that city deals with them. So
Okay.
without knowing that information, it would be difficult. But
Okay. It should be in their zoning code then. It should be in their zoning code. But okay, I just needed to figure out, it seemed very strange that you wouldn't be allowed to build a residence back in a residential area, that they would change the criteria. It sounds like something that would have happened, but you guys remedied it with the overlay zone.
Yeah.
for that older area. So,
We
okay.
tried. I mean, there may be cases where it wouldn't work out for Edwardsville and we might be in that same situation, but we did try, and we go down to lots that are, I think, 40 feet wide. So
Okay. I
we
was
do
just
take
kind of
in very
curious.
small lots.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yep.
One other question I
Hey.
had, you talked about some of these
Carol, speak.
upcoming.
Someone else is talking now. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Okay, my
Sorry.
turn, okay. You were talking about some of these upcoming community meetings or people having chance to sound out what the community feels like. Where is any of this publicized? How do people know about these meetings? Because sometimes the intelligentsia will have things, but it's always after the fact. Like there was a recent thing on the bike trails, but nobody knew about it ahead of time.
We always post things on our city website, and I know you probably don't want to spend all of your time perusing the city website and trying to find what new agendas have been posted, but you can actually go into our agenda center. So if you scroll down to the very bottom of the City of Edwardsville's webpage, it's just cityofedwardsville.com. Scroll down to the bottom and click on Agenda Center. And in Agenda Center, you can actually sign up for notifications. So you'll get notified when a new agenda has been posted, whether it be for the Plan Commission or the Zoning Board or any other committee we have. So you can always take a look at those agendas. For our Plan Commission meetings, when we're seeking public engagement for long-range plans, I mean, we try to post that stuff on Facebook. When we have an open house for our housing study, that'll be posted on Facebook, and we'll put out a press release and we try to get articles in the paper before things, but before events, but sometimes that doesn't always work out. But yeah, on the city's webpage for sure.
This is Carol June. One question is about mobile homes. So if a mobile home burns down, is there a restriction on you cannot replace it with a mobile home in the city limits? And like if it's on some of them are tucked sometimes in by houses.
Yep. Yeah, I actually don't think that you can right now. I don't think that you can replace it if it burns right now.
Okay, and the other question, I came in late, so I don't know if this has been asked or talked about a minimum house size in tiny homes. Do you have that?
That's a good question. We do have a minimum house size. So our minimum house size is it's either 700 or 750 square feet, and that does not include a garage or utility rooms or anything like that. So I think that's not really considered like tiny house, 700 square feet. I mean, that's a smaller home, but most tiny homes that I've seen or read about are 300 square feet. So there's a difference there. But yeah, we require the minimum first floor size to be 700. And then and that's for a single story home. And then if you have a 2-story home, your minimum first floor size increases to something like 900.
Do you think there will be zoning allowed for tiny home? Let's say I have a friend that moved from Colorado, and she said they had luxury tiny homes, like one had a grand piano and a chandelier in it. I don't know exactly how tiny, but they were on the smaller size, and a community of those. Would that require special zoning? Or could that be a planned unit development or?
Yeah, that would be a planned unit development if someone wanted to do that here in the city of Edwardsville.
They could do it even though it might come in under the smaller than the minimum size. A planned unit development would already do that.
Yeah, they could propose it, and that would be the opportunity for the city council and the plan commission to kind of negotiate that. If you're wanting to go below the minimum size, what other amenities are you willing to provide for the residents and for the community? So they could certainly propose it. It would be up to the elected officials at that time whether or not it would be approved.
Okay, thank you.
Can you define for us exactly what that planned unit development is? I've seen the term, but I'm not sure I'm understanding what it is.
So a planned unit development is Essentially, so it's a zoning overlay. So your property will be zoned single family, commercial, whatever the underlying zoning is, that zoning classification will remain. And a planned unit development is a way for a developer to propose a project that may not necessarily meet all of the requirements of the city code. So we don't have many zoning districts right now that allow for mixed uses, for example. So like the Trace on the Parkway project, that was a planned unit development because that property is zoned B2 and we don't allow for mixed use developments in the B2 district. So they did a planned unit development and they came in and they said, you know, we're gonna do these mixed uses. We're going to connect to the bike trail. We're gonna have the amenities for the residents here. And the city ultimately, you know, hashed all of that out with the developer and it was approved. But it's a way for the city to allow for more creative development. And it's also a way for us to respond quicker to market conditions. So when we make changes to our zoning code, those changes can sometimes take several years. And so if there's a need for new types of housing, you know, a PUD process is something that would take 8 months. So it's, you know, still a long time, but quicker than several years.
Thank you.
I have a question, and I think you probably haven't been around when the 2010 comprehensive plan was made, but we looked at it when we were doing a housing study for the league. And one of the things they said was that, you know, they were going to do a housing study and then they were going to see, you know, if housing, it seemed that housing was necessary for, you know, moderate income people, and that the city was going to, I mean, not build it themselves, but I guess try and get somebody to build it. I'm not really sure what the plan was, but of course it didn't happen. Is there any, like, if this housing study shows a need for, you know, working class kind of like this, or this professional that Sylvia was talking about, a need for housing for those kinds of people, which I presume it will, because we all have anecdotal stories. How would the city respond to that need? Do you have any idea, or is that too far in the future?
I mean, it's probably too far in the future, but just generally speaking, I mean, you know, depending on what the need is, we could, you know, there are zoning code amendments that could be done. There's, you know, all kinds of things happening across the country, like accessory dwelling units or, you know, inclusive zoning. And there's a lot of things that exist that, you know, we could certainly talk about depending on what the need is. And until we know what that need is, we won't know the best remedy for that. So I think there's lots of things potentially on the table.
You would be able to, you would look at the zoning code and see if there was some way you could incorporate it into that code.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think any policy changes, rather than being a comprehensive plan change, it will most likely be a change to our zoning code, to the policies that would permit or prohibit, you know, certain types of housing.
Going back to the question.
Can I say?
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, it's just quick. It's kind of taking off on the earlier question about the $600,000 condos or whatever. And while I know we have lots of rich people in the Edwardsville area, it's sort of like Florida. You can't live where you work because you can't afford to live where you work. Almost like there's a self-fulfilling prophecy going on. People are potentially grabbing these condos are going to be house rich and cash poor because there's nothing else out there for them unless they want to live in Highland or drive another 30 miles. So if you want to live in town, you sacrifice and buy these things. It doesn't mean that's what people would prefer. And it seems like there's, you know, the answer is we'll just annex more land and we'll just build and all this instead of infill or getting reasonably moderately priced houses as part of an infill type thing. It's the developers don't get enough money from that. So they're just constantly building these big ones. And, you know, I don't know anybody who could afford $600,000, but then again, I don't hobnob with the rich and famous in Edwardsville. But how much of this could be self-fulfilling prophecy, people grabbing it for fear it's just going to go up higher and higher versus, or people from St. Louis moving over here?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's, you know, certainly a possibility. Yeah.
See, you know, they used to talk about that a few years ago about the McMansions, and the developers would say, oh, well, that's what people want. Well, the thing of it is, if you're moving into an area and you need a house for your family, you buy what's there. It doesn't, as Lynn just said, maybe not what they want to do, but they don't have those choices. Just like the young professional woman, what choices does she have in Edwardsville?
John, did you have a question?
Yes, I wanted to say a couple things. First of all, I do hobnob with the rich and famous in Edwardsville. They cling to me like cat hair. And, you know, believe it or not, there's one of them that's better than anybody else I've ever met in Edwardsville. I'll just tell you this right off, so you know. So quit worrying about that, because they're just like you, only, you know, rich and famous. So I want to point out, two things. One, that the group that I helped found, and Emily, this is my wife, Carol Gert. She's in a different room, so if she sounds like me,
Hi, Carol.
that's why. But I pointed out all the strategies in various resource documents, and more or less offered to write out a list for the city administrator, who said, oh, no, that's pie. No, we're not there yet. So I'm just saying, Edwardsville could begin to put a housing trust fund together, find a source. There's lots of things that they could do now. They choose not to. It's not the highest priority right now. That's okay. I mean, I have not been haranguing you like these ladies have, because I know that it's a stalemate. But I'm just telling you, it's not for lack of information or experience. It is not. That's all. That I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just saying it's not. And the other thing I wanted to say is, I'm telling you, these questions with all this oomph behind them that you've been fielding, I admire your poise, because you won't find another set of people who can pack as much in a question as these friends of mine.
No, this has been a really good conversation. I appreciate it. I appreciate, you know, that you all are so interested in what's going on in the community. I mean, that's important and necessary. I would be very concerned if I gave my presentation and there was not a single question.
You play devil's advocate here. Developers would not be building these things if they were not selling, correct?
Yeah. I mean, you know, they're not going to do it if it doesn't make financial sense, unless there's some kind of a subsidy or something else involved.
So let me throw in a comment just about developers. I admire a lot of the developments that have been going on recently. I think some of them have been just terrific. But I'm from a town about the size of Edwardsville. It's Lincoln, Illinois. It's up in mid-state, and it's a county seat, so it's comparable in a lot of ways. And something that's been going on there recently is they've got a couple of community groups working together, and and the high school shop team. And what they're doing is they're building tiny homes for veterans who have nothing. They're kind of, you know, elderly or don't have resources. So they're building tiny homes for veterans. They've done 2 so far. There's no developer involved. There's no planned unit development involved, because of course they're not developers, but they're able to do these, and they've been hugely successful. They're like front page on the local paper, and the families get involved, and everybody has pictures, and all kinds of churches are getting involved. It's been huge, just huge. And I don't know how that sort of thing might happen here, especially if we're relying mostly on developers. And I don't know what other path you have, you know, or if there's even the bandwidth of anybody who'd want to do something like that. But it seems like developers of various levels are driving all the decisions.
I just they're driving them. They're driving the economy. You know, their decisions are driving the market. Right? It's true, but well, I can't. Never mind.
It leaves me
I'm
wordless
sorry.
too.
Well, you said something else that I wanted to address, and I forgot. What was this? What was the other thing you were talking about besides the last thing you said was developers are driving the market. What were you talking about right before that?
Well, the people putting these homes together, I mean, it's the local high school
Oh,
group, our
right, Lincoln,
church,
right,
community groups.
right.
There's no
Our
developer
group,
involved.
right? The Edwardsville Housing Authority, I mean Housing Alliance. I'm sorry, Edwardsville Community Housing Alliance. You know, we've talked to Habitat for Humanity, and who wants to do more. And that's exactly the kind of project that they have done in other places. And they could theoretically do it here. Now, what's happened is that they've inserted a layer of sort of regional management over what were just like completely autonomous local chapters. And so they're getting to know each other. So we talked to the new guy who was the regional, and he's like, yes, projects. We yes, there's even funding for subsidized multi-site, moderate income, worker housing. All this is yes, but then they have to work it out with the local. So that was very, very hopeful too, that we had that conversation, because it really has to be someone with a long history of developing with a mission that has nothing to do with profit. You know what I mean? It just has to be. So maybe, I hope.
Okay. I'm going to change the focus for a minute and ask about the Plum Creek property.
Mm-hmm.
And Emily, something you said at the beginning of your talk, that if developers or builders meet all of the bulk guidelines, that you cannot deny them a building permit. Is that correct? So that whoever bought that Plum Creek property, as long as they meet all your standards, you cannot deny them a development?
Yeah, so right now, the property is zoned B2, which is our commercial district. If someone walks in the door with a building permit tomorrow that meets every single regulation that the city has for that district and otherwise, we would not really be able to deny their permit. Like I said, we could deny it, but we're setting ourselves up for a legal battle and a loss. So we wouldn't, because we wouldn't spend the money on that. So yeah, I mean, it's zoned for commercial use.
Okay. What about the property along Plum Street? Is that all owned by private people?
Which property along Plum Street? Are we talking about the corner at Governor's and Plum?
No, I'm just talking about all of the vacant property along Plum Street, because you have some development. And I thought when that quote bypass was built, that it was to bypass some of the traffic on 159. But if we have a lot of building, we're going to have two 159s.
Yeah, a lot of that property on Plum Street is owned by MCT. So where the trail gets closer to the road, I think a lot of that is MCT property, so that won't have any commercial development on it. The right of way is pretty large in some places. So you know, I don't think there's much opportunity for development north of the intersection of Governors and Plum.
Right.
There's really not much opportunity. The next development is the park at Plum Creek where Peel used to be located. And that, I think there's 2 lots there for sale, but they're part of that development. So it's not going to go any further south. You know, unless MCT decides to sell property, which they're not going to.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Emily? Okay, well, hearing none, I will thank you, Emily, for spending
Yes,
some
thank
of
you.
your time with us.
Yeah, thank you all very much. I appreciate the opportunity. It was nice to speak with everyone. And, you know, my contact information is on the city. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email. It's also just my first initial and last name. So ecalderon@cityofedwardsville.com if you need to email. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Bye.
you, Emily.
Bye-bye.
It was really
Thank you,
good.
Becky.
Thanks.
Thank you for arranging this, Becky.
Yes, Becky, thank you.
Yes.
Good night.
Right.
Good night,
Night.
all.